The fluorescent lights in Block C had been flickering for 3 weeks. In those stuttering moments of darkness, Churchill had mapped every blind spot, every shadow, every place where a man could die without the cameras catching it. He stood under the cold spray of Showerhead 7, letting the rust-tinged water wash away another day of Nigerian heat and concrete dust. His back was to the entrance, but the cracked mirror mounted on the far wall showed him everything he needed to see. 3 shapes moving through the steam. 3 men who'd learned to kill in places where killing was currency. Churchill's fingers found the sliver of metal he'd worked loose from his bunk frame over the past month. 4 inches of sharpened steel, wrapped in torn fabric at one end. In Kirikiri, you either prepared for violence or became its victim. Viktor Kozlov moved first, just as Churchill knew he would. The Russian had always been impatient, even during those bloody months in Somalia when Churchill had tracked him through refugee camps where Kozlov sold weapons to children. The man's boots squeaked against wet concrete, 15 feet away and closing. Marcel Dubois flanked left, his breathing heavy from years of cigarettes and desert sand. Churchill had last seen the Frenchman in a Sudanese prison, screaming about revenge as they dragged him away in chains. That was 8 years ago. Dubois had kept his promise to remember. James Morrison held back, weapon ready. The South African specialty had been close-quarters killing, and he'd trained half the mercenaries who died in bush wars that never made international headlines. Morrison would wait for the others to engage, then finish whatever remained. Churchill closed his eyes and counted heartbeats, his own, theirs, the rhythm of violence that he'd learned to read like sheet music during 23 years in Her Majesty's service. Tommy Churchill. Kozlov's voice echoed off tile walls. "You look older." "Prison food," Churchill replied without turning around. "Terrible for the complexion." "Should have minded your own business in Lagos," Dubois said, his accent thick with hatred. "Should have let the arms dealers do their work." Churchill finally turned, water still running down his scarred back. 3 men in prison orange, each carrying steel. Morrison's blade was the longest, a piece of bed frame ground to razor sharpness. The South African had always been thorough. "Which one of you is going to explain how you knew I was Thomas Churchill?" he asked, his voice calm as Sunday morning. "Because I've been Winston Hartley for 18 months. Even the warden thinks that's my name." The 3 men exchanged glances. Churchill caught it in the mirror's reflection, the moment they realized they'd revealed too much. "Doesn't matter," Morrison said. "Dead men don't need names." "True," Churchill agreed. "But before we get to that unpleasantness, humor an old spy's curiosity. Someone told you who I really was. Someone who knows about Somalia, about Sudan, about all those little wars where we played our games. Someone who wants me dead badly enough to arrange this reunion." Kozlov laughed, but it was forced. "Maybe we just have good memories." "Your memory is excellent, Victor. I remember how you cried when they pulled your fingernails out in Mogadishu. But you knew me as Agent Whitmore in Somalia. Thomas Churchill was a different identity altogether." The shower block fell silent except for running water and the distant sounds of night guards making their rounds. Churchill watched 3 killers realize they were having a conversation they hadn't planned for. "Someone fed you intelligence," he continued. "Someone who had access to MI6 files from the 1990s. Someone who knew exactly which prison I'd end up in and how to get word to you 3. Morrison shifted his grip on the sharpened steel. "Enough talking. One more question," Churchill said, his tone still conversational. "Did they promise to reduce your sentences? Early parole, perhaps? Or did they threaten to make your lives here even more miserable?" Dubois cracked first. "They said you'd burn us all if you ever got out. Said you kept records." "Marcel," Kozlov hissed. "I do keep records," Churchill admitted, "but not the kind they told you about. The question is, who's afraid of what I know?" The lights flickered again. In that moment of darkness, Churchill moved. Not toward the exit, not toward his improvised weapon, but deeper into the shower block where the cameras couldn't see. When the fluorescence steadied, he was standing in the blind spot he'd identified weeks ago. The place where prison surveillance couldn't reach. The place where 3 mercenaries would have to come to him. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying a new edge that hadn't been there before. The voice of a man who'd killed in places that didn't exist on official maps. Before we finish this dance, you should know something about the person who sent you." Churchill smiled, and for the first time in 18 months, he looked exactly like what he was, a predator who'd been pretending to be prey. "They lied to you about everything." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, broken only by the steady drip of water from the broken showerhead above. Churchill could feel the weight of their attention, 3 predators reassessing their prey, and in that moment of hesitation, something unexpected happened. A memory surfaced unbidden from the depths he'd tried so hard to bury. Sarah's laugh echoing through the safe house in Belgrade, her fingers tracing the scar on his shoulder from the Beirut operation. "Promise me something, Tommy. Promise me when this is all over, we'll have a life that doesn't involve looking over our shoulders." He'd promised. God help him. He'd actually believed they could have that life. What lies! Morrison's voice cut through the steam, but Churchill heard the uncertainty underneath the bravado. Churchill shifted slightly, his bare feet finding better purchase on the slick concrete. Every muscle in his body had learned to calculate distance, trajectory, the split-second timing that separated survival from obituary. But standing there, water cooling on his skin, he wasn't thinking about the immediate threat. He was thinking about how they'd found him, how someone had reached into Kirikiri maximum security prison with information that should have died with Operation Blackwater 24 years ago. "The records they told you I kept," Churchill said, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "They're not what you think. I wasn't documenting your war crimes for blackmail. I was documenting something else entirely." The fluorescent light above Kozlov's head flickered, casting his scarred face in alternating shadow and harsh white. The Russian had lost weight since Somalia, prison food, and the particular kind of stress that came from sleeping with one eye open. But his hands were steady, and his stance still spoke of the Spetsnaz training that had made him valuable to warlords across 3 continents. "You're stalling," Dubois said, but he made no move to close the distance. Churchill smiled, and it was the first genuine expression that had crossed his face in months. "Marcel, do you remember what you told me in that refugee camp outside Kismayo, when I had you cornered with 15 kilos of stolen UN medical supplies?" The Frenchman's jaw tightened. "I remember a lot of things. You said the only people more dangerous than soldiers were spies who'd stopped believing in their mission." Churchill's voice carried the weight of water and years. "You were right. But what you didn't understand then, what none of you understood, was why I'd stopped believing." In the distance, a guard's radio crackled with indistinct chatter. Night rounds in Kirikiri followed patterns Churchill had memorized during his first week. Guard Station 7 would be empty for another 12 minutes. Plenty of time for 3 men to kill a 4th and arrange the scene to look like an accident. Wet floors, concrete walls, a man slipping and striking his head, it happened more often than the Ministry of Justice cared to acknowledge. But Churchill wasn't thinking about the guard's schedule, or the camera's blind spots, or the improvised weapons they all carried. He was thinking about Sarah's face the last time he'd seen her, standing in the doorway of their London flat with tears streaming down her cheeks and 2 suitcases at her feet. "They offered you a desk job, Tommy, a normal life. You could have said yes. You know I can't do that. I know you won't do that. There's a difference." She'd been right, of course. He'd chosen the mission over everything else, just as he'd always done, just as he was about to do again. Operation Blackwater wasn't about arms dealing, Churchill continued, his eyes moving between the 3 men who'd shaped so much of his past. It was about intelligence, about a network of assets that MI6 had been cultivating since the end of the Cold War. People in positions of power across Africa, Eastern Europe, the Middle East. Politicians, military commanders, business leaders. The arms deals, the mercenary contracts, the small wars, all of it was cover for something much larger. Morrison's weapon hand tensed almost imperceptibly. "You're lying. The person who sent you here knows I have files on that network," Churchill said, his voice carrying the rhythm of approaching violence. "Not your files. Not records of mercenary activities or war crimes. I have the real names, bank accounts, and operational histories of British intelligence assets who are still active today. People who've spent decades building legitimate lives on foundations of blood and classified secrets." Kozlov took a half step forward. Even if that's true, it's true, because one of those assets is the person who had me framed for arms dealing in Lagos. Churchill's smile disappeared entirely. Someone I trusted, someone I loved, someone who knew exactly how to destroy my credibility and bury me in a place where questions don't get asked and evidence doesn't survive. The water from the broken shower head hit the concrete with steady percussion, marking time like a metronome. Churchill could feel his heartbeat settling into the calm rhythm that had carried him through operations in places that existed only in redacted files. He was ready to fight. But more than that, he was ready to remember why some secrets were worth dying for. The standoff stretched another heartbeat, then Morrison's radio crackled to life, a sound that shouldn't have been there. Guards didn't carry personal communications into Block C after lights out. The device was small, civilian, hidden in his pocket until that moment. Churchill. The voice that emerged from the static was crystal clear, transmitted through the shower blocks, acoustics, with deliberate precision. A woman's voice, cultured, familiar in a way that made Churchill's blood turn to ice water. 24 years collapsed into nothing. The concrete walls of Kirikiri vanished, replaced by rain-soaked streets in Belfast, then a safe house in Prague, then a hotel room in Cairo where he'd learned what it meant to trust someone completely. The voice belonged to ghosts and promises, to a life he'd thought was buried so deep it could never claw its way back to the surface. "Hello, Tommy." Sarah Blackwood, Assistant Deputy Director of Operations, MI6. The woman who'd shared his bed for 3 years and his secrets for longer. The woman who'd walked away from him in London because he couldn't give up the mission. The woman who'd sworn she was done with field work, done with the games, done with the kind of life that required sleeping with weapons under pillows. The woman who'd just orchestrated an assassination attempt in a Nigerian maximum security prison. Churchill's hand moved toward the sharpened metal at his side, then stopped. The 3 mercenaries were watching him now with something approaching fascination, as if they could see the exact moment his world fractured along fault lines he'd thought were healed. "You look surprised," Sarah's voice continued through Morrison's radio. The South African was smiling now, enjoying the revelation. "Did you think I wouldn't know where you'd ended up? Did you think I wouldn't know about Lagos, about the investigation that got too close to people I'm paid to protect?" Churchill found his voice, though it felt like speaking through broken glass. "You're supposed to be in analysis, desk work. You promised—" "I promised a lot of things, Tommy. Most of them to people who are dead now." The transmission carried the faint sound of traffic, suggesting she was calling from London, from the building where they'd first met during a briefing on arms trafficking in the Balkans. "But promises don't pay for the kind of life I wanted after you chose your bloody mission over everything else." Kozlov shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with a conversation he didn't understand. But Dubois was listening intently, his weapon lowered as if he sensed something valuable in what he was hearing. The Frenchman had always been clever about information, about knowing when intelligence was worth more than immediate violence. "Operation Blackwater," Churchill said. "You were the control officer. You fed information to the assets, managed the network. The pieces were falling into place like a puzzle he'd been trying to solve for 18 months. When I started investigating the arms deals in Lagos, I wasn't just threatening corrupt officials, I was threatening your people. Our people, Tommy. You recruited half of them yourself." Sarah's laugh was sharp enough to cut. "Did you really think those contacts you made in Somalia, in Sudan, in all those lovely little wars, did you think they just disappeared when you moved on? They were useful. They became useful in new ways." Morrison pulled the radio closer to his mouth. "Ma'am, should we—" "You should listen," Sarah interrupted, "because Tommy's about to learn something that might change his perspective on dying nobly for Queen and country." The shower block's fluorescent lights flickered again, and in that moment of uncertainty, Churchill felt something shift inside him. Not fear, he'd moved beyond fear years ago. Not anger, though that was certainly present. What he felt was recognition. The moment when an operation revealed its true scope, when the mission parameters expanded beyond anything in the briefing files. "The arms dealer who framed you in Lagos," Sarah continued. "Adebayo Okafor. Lovely man, terrible teeth. He's been feeding intelligence to Moscow for 6 years while pretending to work for us. a triple agent with delusions of grandeur and a bank account in the Seychelles. Churchill's improvised weapon felt suddenly heavy in his hand. "You knew?" "Of course I knew. I've been managing his intelligence for 3 years, feeding him carefully crafted misinformation about British operations in West Africa while he thinks he's bleeding us dry of secrets. It's a beautiful arrangement, really. He gets to feel important. Moscow gets useless intelligence, and we get a direct pipeline to Russian operational planning, until I started investigating his arms deals. Until you started asking questions that would have exposed not just Okafor, but the entire network he's connected to. 24 years of carefully cultivated assets, Tommy. People in positions of power who trust us because we've never betrayed them. People who would disappear overnight if anyone realized they'd been feeding intelligence to London. The radio crackled with static, then cleared. When Sarah spoke again, her voice carried the weight of finality. "I couldn't let you destroy that. Not even for you." The radio went silent, leaving only the sound of dripping water and 3 men breathing in the humid air. Churchill stared at the device in Morrison's hand, as if it might explain how 24 years of careful compartmentalization had just collapsed into rubble. "That's not possible," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were lies he was telling himself. Sarah had always been brilliant at operational planning, brilliant enough to disappear from his life completely when she'd wanted to, brilliant enough to resurface when she needed him dead. Kozlov was the first to break position, taking a step backward toward the shower block entrance. The Russian's eyes had gone flat, the look of a man who just realized he was standing in the middle of something much larger than a simple prison killing. "We should go," Kozlov said quietly. "No." Dubois still held his weapon, but his attention was fixed on Churchill's face. "I want to hear the rest of this." Morrison looked uncertain for the first time since entering the showers. "She said to make it look like an accident." "She said a lot of things," Churchill replied. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, hollow, distant, as if someone else was speaking. "But she didn't tell you about the fail-safe." It was a bluff, but a good one. Churchill had learned long ago that the most effective lies were built on foundations of truth, and the truth was that Sarah Blackwood never ran operations without multiple contingencies. If she wanted him dead, there would be backup plans, alternative methods, other assets in position. "What fail-safe?" Morrison demanded. Churchill smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You think she trusted this to 3 mercenaries in a Nigerian prison? You think she's not watching right now, making sure you follow through?" He gestured toward the corners of the shower block where the cameras couldn't see. "She knows about the blind spots too, James. She knows about the guards' schedule. She knows exactly how long you have before someone comes looking." The 3 men exchanged glances, and Churchill saw doubt creeping in. Good. Doubt was a weapon he could use. "If we don't finish this," Kozlov began. "She has other options," Churchill finished. "She always has other options. The question is, what happens to you when I turn up dead? Do you think the Nigerian authorities won't investigate? Do you think British intelligence won't ask questions about how Winston Hartley, minor arms dealer, ended up murdered by 3 men who coincidentally all had connections to African conflicts from the 1990s? Dubois lowered his weapon completely. "Merde." "Marcel sees it," Churchill continued, pressing his advantage. "You're not assassins. You're loose ends. The moment I'm dead, you become liabilities. People who know too much about an operation that officially doesn't exist." The shower block suddenly felt colder. Morrison's radio remained silent, but Churchill could feel Sarah's presence anyway, a weight pressing down on all of them from somewhere thousands of miles away. She was listening, watching, calculating the probability that her first plan would succeed in preparing alternatives in case it failed. "So what do you suggest?" Morrison asked, his voice tight. Churchill considered his options. He could fight, 3 against 1 in a confined space with improvised weapons. He might survive, but probably not. He could try to convince them to walk away, but men like these didn't live long by showing weakness. Or he could do what Sarah would never expect. "I suggest," Churchill said slowly, "that we have a conversation about what really happened in Lagos, about why a war crimes investigator with a spotless record suddenly found himself framed for arms dealing, about who benefits when people like me disappear into places like this." Kozlov had backed almost to the entrance now. This is not what we agreed to." "No," Churchill agreed. "This is much more complicated than what you agreed to, which means you have a choice to make. You can kill me and hope Sarah Blackwood honors whatever deal she made with you. Or you can listen to what I have to say and decide whether you want to be her pawns or her partners." The fluorescent light flickered again, casting shifting shadows across the wet concrete. In those shadows, Churchill saw the ghosts of operations past, the faces of assets who'd trusted him, contacts who'd believed in the mission, colleagues who died believing they were serving something larger than themselves. Sarah had been right about one thing. Promises didn't matter when survival was at stake. But she'd underestimated how much Churchill had learned about survival during 18 months in Kirikiri maximum security prison. 5 minutes, Morrison said finally. "Then we finish this one way or another." Churchill nodded. 5 minutes to unravel 24 years of lies. 5 minutes to turn 3 killers into allies. 5 minutes to figure out how to survive the woman who'd once promised to love him until the world ended. The wet concrete beneath Churchill's feet felt like quicksand as the 5-minute countdown began in his head. He could see Morrison checking his watch, a nervous habit the South African had developed during his years running black ops in Angola, the same habit that had nearly gotten him killed during a hostage exchange in Luanda. "Lagos," Churchill began, his voice cutting through the shower block's oppressive humidity. "October 2022. I was investigating arms shipments through Port Complex when I stumbled across something that didn't belong in any legitimate weapons transfer. British-manufactured surveillance equipment, listening devices, satellite uplinks, encrypted communication arrays, military-grade intelligence hardware flowing to rebel groups who shouldn't have been able to afford cigarettes, let alone MI6 standard-issue spy gear." Dubois shifted his weight, interested despite himself. So I started asking questions, following paper trails, tracing serial numbers. Churchill's memory pulled up images of shipping manifests, customs documents, bank transfers that led nowhere and everywhere. What I found was a supply chain that stretched from Birmingham to Benghazi, from Cardiff to Khartoum. Someone was using arms dealers as cover to distribute intelligence equipment to assets across Africa. Kozlov had stopped backing toward the exit. "Your network." "Our network," Churchill corrected, the word tasting bitter. "Assets." Sarah and I had recruited together during the post-Cold War scramble for influence. Warlords, politicians, military commanders, people who could provide intelligence in exchange for support. Except somewhere along the line, the operation expanded beyond intelligence gathering. The showerhead's persistent dripping marked time like a funeral march. Churchill could feel pieces of the puzzle clicking into place, connections he'd been too close to see, patterns that only made sense from inside a prison cell 18 months later. "They weren't just reporting to us anymore," he continued. "They were actively shaping conflicts, starting wars, ending them, directing the flow of weapons and money to achieve strategic objectives, the kind of objectives that required deniable operations and expendable assets." Morrison's radio crackled with static, then went silent. Sarah was listening, but she wasn't interrupting, letting him talk, letting him reveal how much he'd figured out before she decided whether his death was still necessary. "The arms dealer who framed me, Okafor, he was feeding information to Moscow while pretending to work for London. But that wasn't coincidence, that was design. Sarah needed a Russian asset with credible access to British operations, someone Moscow would trust enough to share their African strategies. "Double agent," Dubois said quietly. "Triple agent," Churchill corrected. "Working for Moscow, controlled by London, and completely unaware that his British handler was feeding him intelligence, designed to manipulate Russian policy across West Africa." Sarah was playing a game 3 moves deeper than anyone realized. The fluorescent light above them flickered again, and in that moment of uncertainty, Churchill saw something that made his blood freeze. Kozlov's eyes had gone wide, not with fear, but with recognition. The Russian understood something the others hadn't grasped yet. "You know, don't you?" Churchill asked him. "You know what this means?" Kozlov nodded slowly. If British intelligence has been manipulating Russian operations in Africa for 6 years, if they've been feeding Moscow false intelligence through a triple agent, he paused, calculations running behind his scarred features. The Syrian operation, the Wagner Group deployment in Mali, the mineral rights negotiations in the Central African Republic, all based on intelligence from Okafor, Churchill confirmed, all shaped by information Sarah wanted Moscow to receive. She's been steering Russian policy across 3 continents while making them think they were outplaying British intelligence. Morrison's weapon hand was trembling now, not from fear, from the magnitude of what they were discussing. How many people know about this? That's the question, isn't it? Churchill moved closer, water from his hair dripping onto the concrete. How many people are expendable when an operation this large starts to unravel? How many loose ends need to be tied off? The radio crackled to life again. Sarah's voice emerged from the static, but this time it carried an edge that hadn't been there before. Very good, Tommy. You always were thorough with your post-operational analysis. Not thorough enough, Churchill replied, addressing the device in Morrison's hand. I didn't realize you were already running networks when we were together in London. I thought you'd given up field work. I never gave up anything. I just got better at hiding it. Sarah's laugh was different now, sharper, colder. But you're missing the most important piece. The reason why you can't be allowed to walk out of that prison cell. Churchill felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that whatever was coming would be worse than anything he'd already learned. The Syrian chemical weapons investigation you filed 3 years ago, the one that led to sanctions against Damascus. The intelligence came from Okafor, filtered through Moscow, shaped by information I provided. Sarah's voice carried the weight of revelation. 1,200 people died because of intelligence I manufactured, Tommy. 1,200 people whose deaths made my operation more credible to Russian handlers. The shower block went completely silent except for the sound of water hitting concrete. Churchill stared at the radio, understanding finally why Sarah needed him dead. He hadn't just discovered her network, he'd discovered her body count. Plot twist. The number hit Churchill like a physical blow, 1,200, and suddenly every memory from his investigation 3 years ago began reshaping itself into something monstrous. The Syrian intelligence reports he'd filed, the ones that had felt so clean, so righteous, children's hospitals bombed, refugee camps shelled, mass graves that satellite imagery couldn't quite explain. He'd thought he was saving lives. You're lying, Churchill said, but his voice carried no conviction. The pieces were already falling into place. The timing, the sources, the way Sarah had encouraged him to pursue that investigation when everyone else at MI6 had wanted it buried. Am I? Sarah's voice through the radio held the patience of someone who'd been waiting years to have this conversation. Remember how proud you were of that intelligence? How perfectly it aligned with everything Damascus was already suspected of doing? How convenient it was that Okafor's Russian contacts had exactly the proof we needed. Morrison was watching Churchill's face, reading the devastation there like a map. The South African had seen men broken by revelation before, assets who discovered they'd been working for the wrong side, operatives who learned their missions had been lies wrapped in patriotic packaging. The chemical weapons investigation, Churchill whispered. You wanted me to file that report. I needed you to file it. Your reputation, your credibility. When Thomas Churchill testified before Parliament about Syrian war crimes, people listened. When you presented evidence to the International Criminal Court, they acted. Sarah's laugh was soft, almost gentle. You were always the moral center of our partnership, Tommy, the conscience that made everything else possible. Dubois had lowered his weapon completely now, understanding that he was witnessing something more devastating than any physical violence. Kozlov remained by the entrance, but his eyes were fixed on Churchill with something approaching sympathy. But the evidence was real, Churchill said, grasping for something solid in a world that had suddenly lost all foundation. The witness testimony, the documentation. The witness testimony came from sources I'd been cultivating for 6 years. The documentation was manufactured by people who believed they were helping bring justice to Syria. Sarah's voice carried no triumph, only the flat certainty of someone explaining a mathematical equation. I gave you exactly what you needed to see, Tommy. What you wanted to see. A clear moral choice in a complicated world. Churchill's improvised weapon slipped from his fingers, clattering on the wet concrete. In his memory, he could see himself in the parliamentary chamber, presenting evidence with absolute conviction. The weight of righteousness he'd felt, the satisfaction of knowing he was finally doing something that mattered, something that would save innocent lives. 1,200 people. The sanctions that followed your testimony, Sarah continued, they destabilized Damascus enough to create a power vacuum in 3 provinces. Provinces that Russian-backed militias moved into within 6 months. Provinces rich in mineral deposits that Okafor's network helped redirect to Moscow-friendly buyers. You used me, Churchill said. The words felt inadequate, too small for the magnitude of what he was understanding. I used us both, but you I used with love, with genuine affection for the man you were trying to be. And there it was, the line that exposed everything. Sarah's voice carried a warmth that felt obscene given what she was revealing. You always wanted to be the hero, Tommy. I just gave you the script. The shower block seemed to tilt around Churchill. 24 years of careful moral calculations, of believing in the mission, of trusting that the work they did served something larger than themselves. All of it built on foundations that Sarah had manufactured. Morrison was speaking into his radio now, his voice urgent. Ma'am, we have a problem. He's exactly where I expected him to be, Sarah interrupted. Discovering that the woman he loved has been orchestrating his entire professional life. Learning that every moral victory he's achieved has been part of someone else's agenda. Churchill looked up at the 3 men surrounding him. Killers, all of them, but honest in their brutality. At least they'd never pretended their violence served a higher purpose. The beautiful irony, Sarah continued, is that you're still trying to be the hero, still looking for a way to make this right, to find the moral center in what I've told you. But there isn't one, darling. There never was. There was just me, managing your conscience like any other operational asset. Something shifted in Churchill's chest, not breaking, but crystallizing. Sarah had made one crucial error in her revelation. She'd assumed that learning the truth would destroy him, would leave him paralyzed by the weight of his unwitting complicity. Instead, it was setting him free. For the first time in 18 months, Thomas Churchill smiled with genuine warmth. You're wrong about one thing, Sarah, he said to the radio. You always underestimated how much I hate being played. Morrison's finger tightened on the radio as Churchill's smile widened, and for the first time since entering the shower block, the South African looked genuinely unsettled. It wasn't the smile of a broken man. It was the expression of someone who just realized he'd been holding back for no good reason. You think this changes something? Sarah's voice crackled through the speaker, but Churchill detected the first note of uncertainty he'd heard from her. You think learning the truth gives you some kind of advantage? Actually, yes. Churchill straightened. 18 months of prison-honed muscle memory, adjusting his posture from victim to predator. Because you've been operating under the assumption that I still care about protecting your network. That I'm still the man who puts the mission above everything else. He turned to face Morrison directly, ignoring the weapon still pointed at his chest. Tell me, James, what did she promise you? A way out of Nigeria? Clean papers? Or just enough money to disappear somewhere the Wagner Group can't find you? Morrison's jaw tightened. That's not your concern. Everything about this is my concern now. Churchill's voice carried an authority that 18 months in Kirikiri hadn't diminished. Because Sarah's made one critical error in her calculations. She's told me about the Syrian operation, about the 1,200 people who died to make her network more credible. She's revealed the scope of her manipulation, thinking it would break me. Kozlov was nodding slowly, beginning to understand. But now, you have nothing left to protect. Exactly. Churchill looked directly at the radio in Morrison's hand. You remember what you said about promises, Sarah? About how they don't matter when survival is at stake? Well, my promise to keep your secrets just became irrelevant. You've already shown me what those secrets were worth. The shower block filled with a silence so complete that Churchill could hear his own heartbeat. When Sarah spoke again, her voice carried the flat, dangerous tone of someone recalculating odds in real time. You're bluffing. You won't burn the network because innocent assets will die. Will they? Churchill stepped closer to Morrison, close enough that the weapon was almost touching his chest. Or will the people who die be the ones who've been enabling a 20-year campaign of manipulation and manufactured atrocities? Tell me, Sarah, how many of your innocent assets know exactly what they've been helping you accomplish? Dubois was backing toward the wall now, his survival instincts screaming warnings. The Frenchman had spent enough time in conflict zones to recognize the moment when a situation moved beyond anyone's control. Besides, Churchill continued, his voice gaining momentum, you've already decided these 3 men are expendable. You're planning to eliminate them the moment they eliminate me, which means the network is already contracting. The question is whether it contracts according to your timeline or mine. Morrison's radio hand was trembling now. What are you suggesting? Churchill smiled again, and this time there was something predatory in the expression. I'm suggesting that Sarah has made the same mistake every puppet master eventually makes. She's forgotten that her puppets can cut their own strings. You can't control the information once it's released. Sarah's voice carried a desperation that she was fighting to conceal. Parliamentary committees, international tribunals, they'll demand details you don't have access to. They'll destroy legitimate operations along with the compromised ones. True, Churchill agreed. I can't control how the information gets used, but I can control how it gets released. And more importantly, I can control whether certain people are still alive to provide context when it surfaces. The implication hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Churchill was no longer talking about protecting or exposing the network. He was talking about war. Kozlov spoke quietly from the entrance. Morrison, we need to leave. Now. No. Churchill's voice cut across the shower block with absolute authority. Nobody leaves until we finish this conversation, because there's one more thing Sarah hasn't told you about the contingency plans she's prepared. Morrison looked confused. What contingency plans? Churchill gestured toward the radio. Ask her about the cleanup protocol she's already initiated. Ask her what happens to former assets when an operation gets burned. Ask her why she really needs me dead in a Nigerian prison instead of just discredited and ignored. The silence stretched until Sarah's voice emerged, colder than Churchill had ever heard it, because some secrets are worth more than the people who keep them. There it is, Churchill said softly. The truth you've all been dancing around. She's not trying to protect the network from exposure. She's trying to protect herself from the network when it realizes how expendable she's made them all. Morrison's weapon wavered for the first time. Ma'am? Kill him, Sarah's voice snapped through the radio. Kill him now or I'll find people who will. But Churchill was no longer looking at Morrison or the weapon. He was looking at Kozlov, at Dubois, at 3 men who were beginning to understand that they weren't just killers in this scenario. They were targets. Climax. Morrison's weapon didn't waver this time. It dropped completely. The South African stared at the radio in his hand, as if it had transformed into something venomous. When he spoke, his voice carried the hollow realization of a man discovering he'd been digging his own grave. The extraction plan. Lagos Airport, tomorrow night. Private charter to Johannesburg. Morrison looked up at Churchill. She was never planning to honor it, was she? Think about it, Churchill said gently. You know her operational history. When has Sarah Blackwood ever left loose ends? Kozlov pushed away from the entrance, moving deeper into the shower block. The Russian's scarred face had gone pale beneath the fluorescent lighting. The safe house in Abuja, the one she arranged for after the job. How many people know about it? Just us, Dubois whispered, understanding flooding his features. Just the 3 people who would have knowledge of Churchill's death. Churchill nodded slowly. A gas leak, probably. Maybe a car accident on the way to the airport. Clean, efficient, and it eliminates the only witnesses to what happened in Kirikiri maximum security prison. The radio crackled with static. Sarah's voice emerged, no longer cold but urgent, desperate. James, you're listening to a man who's been manipulating intelligence for 2 decades. He's trying to turn you against the only person who can guarantee your safety. Morrison looked at the device with something approaching disgust. My safety or my silence? Your life, Sarah snapped. Kill him now, and I'll honor every agreement we've made. Let him talk, and we're all dead when this reaches Whitehall. But Churchill was already shaking his head. You're still thinking like an asset, James. Still believing that compliance equals survival. But ask yourself, when in Sarah's entire career has she ever allowed subordinates to hold information that could destroy her? The showerhead's persistent dripping seemed to grow louder in the silence. 3 killers stood in a concrete box, confronting the reality that they'd been hired to eliminate the one person who might keep them alive. The Syrian operation, Kozlov said quietly. 1,200 people died to make the intelligence credible. How many assets who helped with that operation are still breathing? Churchill felt something shift in his chest, not triumph, but a profound sadness for the men who were finally understanding what he'd learned 18 months ago. The weight of being expendable in someone else's grand design. There's another option, he said softly. Morrison raised the radio again, but this time his finger wasn't on the transmit button. What option? We break the chain, all of us, together. Churchill moved closer to the 3 men, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd spent his career managing complex negotiations. Sarah's network depends on compartmentalization, assets who don't know the full scope, handlers who can't connect operations across regions. But between the 4 of us, we have enough pieces to map the entire structure. And then what? Dubois asked. We're still trapped in a Nigerian prison. Are we? Churchill gestured toward Morrison's equipment, the communications gear that connected them to Sarah's operation. Came here with an extraction plan, resources, contacts. Sarah's resources. But once she's neutralized, those resources don't disappear, they just need new management. The implications settled over the shower block like a physical presence. Churchill wasn't just talking about survival, he was talking about inheritance. You're suggesting we take over the network, Kozlov said slowly. I'm suggesting we take control of our own lives. Sarah spent years treating all of us like chess pieces, moving us around the board, sacrificing us when convenient, keeping us ignorant of the larger game. Churchill's voice gained intensity, but she made one crucial error. She taught us how the game is played. Morrison was staring at the radio with an expression Churchill recognized, the look of a man who'd spent years following orders from someone who'd never intended him to survive the mission. The cleanup protocol, Morrison said. She's already initiated it, hasn't she? The moment she ordered our deployment to Nigeria. Churchill nodded. 3 former assets with detailed knowledge of illegal operations, eliminated while carrying out one final assignment. Clean, deniable, and it removes any witnesses to 20 years of manufactured intelligence. The shower block fell silent except for the sound of water hitting concrete. When Morrison finally pressed the transmit button, his voice carried a tone Churchill had never heard from him before, the sound of a leash being cut. Sarah, we need to discuss revised terms. Static answered him for a long moment. When Sarah's voice emerged, it carried a quality that made Churchill's skin crawl, the patience of a predator who'd been expecting this moment. Hello, boys. I was wondering when you'd finally figure it out. Tommy always was good at connecting dots, even when it was against his own interests. But Churchill was no longer listening to Sarah's voice. He was watching Morrison's face transform as the South African realized that even their rebellion had been anticipated, planned for, incorporated into calculations that stretched far beyond what any of them had imagined. Churchill watched the color drain from Morrison's face as the full weight of Sarah's words settled over the shower block. Even their rebellion had been scripted, another scene in a play where they'd never been anything more than actors reading lines someone else had written. But something unexpected happened in that moment of realization. Instead of despair, Churchill felt a profound sense of clarity wash over him, the kind of peace that comes when a man finally stops fighting the current and discovers he can swim. You know what, Sarah? Churchill said, taking the radio from Morrison's nerveless fingers. You're absolutely right. I was always good at connecting dots, even when it was against my own interests. He set the radio carefully on the wet concrete and stepped back. What are you doing? Kozlov demanded. Something I should have done 18 months ago, Churchill replied. reaching for the shower handle. The ancient mechanism protested, then gave way with a grinding screech of metal. Water cascaded down, washing over the radio until Sarah's voice dissolved into static, and then silence. Morrison stared at the drowned device. "She'll assume we're dead." "She'll assume her plan worked perfectly," Churchill corrected. 3 expendable assets eliminated, 1 problem witness silenced, and the network intact. Everything proceeding according to her calculations. The weight of 18 months in Kirikiri, the sleepless nights, the constant vigilance, the suffocating knowledge that he'd been abandoned by everything he'd once believed in, suddenly lifted from Churchill's shoulders. He wasn't fighting to preserve a corrupted system anymore. He wasn't trying to protect people who'd never intended to protect him. He was free. Dubois wiped water from his face, studying Churchill with professional interest. "You have a plan." "I have something better than a plan," Churchill said. "I have nothing left to lose." Over the following days, as word spread through Kirikiri that the 3 foreign mercenaries had mysteriously vanished from the prison, Churchill found himself settling into a routine he hadn't experienced since before his intelligence career began. He woke each morning not to the weight of operational necessity, but to simple choices about how to spend his time. He helped other inmates write letters to family members they couldn't contact. He mediated disputes over resources and territory with the patience of a man who'd negotiated ceasefires in 3 different wars. He taught English to a young Nigerian who'd been imprisoned for political activism, watching the boy's face light up as new possibilities took shape in his mind. 3 weeks after the shower block confrontation, Churchill received an unexpected visitor. Not Sarah, not MI6, not any representative of the network that had abandoned him. Instead, a slight woman in her 30s sat across from him in the visiting room, introducing herself as Rebecca Santos from the International Criminal Court. "Mr. Churchill," she said carefully, "we've received some very interesting information about arms trafficking in West Africa, information that suggests your conviction may have been premature." Churchill studied her face, seeing the careful hope of someone who believed justice might still be possible in a complicated world. "What kind of information?" "Detailed financial records, communication intercepts, testimony from 3 individuals who claim to have direct knowledge of the operation that framed you." Santos leaned forward. "They've requested witness protection in exchange for their cooperation. Morrison, Kozlov, and Dubois. Still alive. Still playing their own angle, but apparently choosing a different script than the one Sarah had written for them." "I see," Churchill said quietly. "The evidence they've provided is compelling. If verified, it could not only overturn your conviction, but expose a network of illegal operations spanning 2 decades. Santos paused. "They've also indicated that you possess information that could help identify other victims of this network." Churchill was quiet for a long moment, thinking of the 1,200 people in Syria, of the manufactured atrocities that had served someone else's agenda, of all the moral victories he'd achieved while unknowingly serving as Sarah's instrument. "Ms. Santos," he said finally, "I think there are some things you should know." 6 months later, Churchill stood in the morning sunlight outside Kirikiri Maximum Security Prison, breathing air that tasted of freedom and rain. The young activist he'd tutored stood beside him, his own conviction overturned as part of the broader investigation that had swept through the Nigerian justice system. Churchill's testimony had been devastating, clinical, complete. Sarah Blackwood's network had crumbled under the weight of revelations that reached from Lagos to London to Moscow. Parliamentary inquiries were ongoing. International arrest warrants had been issued. The carefully constructed web of manipulation and manufactured intelligence was being systematically dismantled. But Churchill felt no triumph in the destruction, only a quiet satisfaction in the truth finally having room to breathe. As he walked away from the prison, Churchill thought about the man who had entered Kirikiri 18 months earlier, still believing in the nobility of the work, still trusting that his sacrifice served a greater good. That man was gone, dissolved like Sarah's voice in the shower room water. In his place stood someone simpler, a man who had learned that the only conscience worth serving was his own, and that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is stop trying to be a hero. The story would stay with him, Churchill knew. Not as a burden, but as a reminder of the weight of choices and the price of trust. But for now, there was only the road ahead, and the quiet peace of a man who had finally stopped running from himself.